Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Marriage and Kinship. Today, we're going to ask a really big question, which is there actually such a thing as a family? So, previously, we've talked about what is love and how love has changed historically, how people in different societies have come to understand it differently. We've talked about the relationship between love and between sex, between love and sex, between sex and marriage, between love and marriage, and how these relationships have changed historically. We've asked, what is marriage even? What does it do? What is it for? Why would you get married? This idea that things historically develop and that our emotional experiences of intimate relationships change across cultures and histories applies not just to marriage, but to the family too. And we've already talked about this a little bit in terms of discussing how the Industrial Revolution transformed family relationships. So going forward, here's a familiar quote from Schneider, right? There is an obvious problem with the view that the bonds of kinship are innate or instinctual. If they are as self-evident as the color of the sky, why were they not automatically noted and immediately converted into a system of consanguinity? Why aren't all our kinship systems the same? So, Schneider's critique of the study of kinship basically amounts to saying kinship scholars took Euro-American ideas about kinship, gave them fancy new Latin names, and formalized it as a system without taking other societies very seriously. So from here on out, we're going to try to really meet Schneider's challenge. We've been looking at the kinds of scholars that Schneider has critiqued, but now we're going to meet his challenge and try to look at some other systems of kinship. But before we can do that, we have to ask this question. Is there a family? Translation is always inexact, and we've been dealing with this since the very beginning. So we can ask whether family in English is the same thing as semya in Russian or otbasi in Kazakh. The Japanese word kazoku, which usually is translated as family, literally means connected to the house, but it's changed meaning over time as European nuclear family norms were exported to Japan. So why might we even believe the family to be universal after all the change that we've seen? The answer is historical. This is something I've already talked about in one of my responses to your comments, but early students of culture, early anthropologists, thought that families and cultures evolved from lower, primitive forms into higher, advanced forms. And in terms of kinship, the idea was that humans started out as foragers, also called hunters and gatherers, and lived in a state of primitive promiscuity where everyone was having sex with everyone. And so you basically call everybody by kinship terms because, how are you supposed to know who your family is as far as you know everybody's family? As agriculture develops, people begin to develop these more distinct, extended kin structures, matrilineal and patrilineal descent groups, but there's still a pretty expansive idea of who counts as kin. And there's this trend towards advanced being smaller that we can see because the most advanced form are the nuclear families that are associated with industrialization. This whole view was perhaps explained most clearly in Friedrich Engels' The Origin of Family, Private Property, and the State, which is a super fun, light read. He was a communist theorist, so he was really excited to see how the family was going to transform under communism, and he is probably very disappointed from beyond the grave because we have not yet moved beyond nuclear families. But this was the view, this evolutionary view. However, early ethnographers who really spent long periods of time in the societies that they were studying, like Bronislaw Malinowski, very quickly learned that primitive peoples actually had incredibly elaborate, complicated, rule-governed cultures, because it turns out that people are complicated whoever they are and wherever they are. So demonstrating that they also had families like civilized people, and by families we mean bounded units of parents and children, basically nuclear families, right? Was an important part in convincing other people that these primitive peoples and cultures deserved respect, actually. At the time, this was an anti-racist argument. All right, so let's look at Malinowski's definition of the family. It has a universal function, which is nurturing young children, and it has 3 features: a bounded group of people that is recognized kin and outsiders, a physical space designated for that group, hearth and home. This physical space can be nomadic, but every family has their yurt, every family has their campfire. And the 3rd feature was family love and affection. And this attitude went unchallenged except for a few modifications, pretty much until Collier and her colleagues wrote the paper that you should have read for today's class. Okay, so we're challenging the universality of family, and this maybe feels like a hard argument to make, like you're trying to undermine society or like you're just being mean, but there are some good reasons, because the first problem with Malinowski's definition of family is that functionalist arguments are generally bad arguments. He argues that the family has this universal function of raising children, but our authors today argue back, and they say just because a social institution performs a necessary function doesn't mean that that function couldn't be performed another way. If families didn't exist, we would still find ways to care for children, or that the function is responsible for the existence of the institution, that children can only be cared for by nuclear family units. Therefore, there must be a family because it's the only way to do it. Much like marriage, in fact, the family does things that are good for society, but they could be accomplished in other ways, just like the various social functions of marriage that we discussed. Another problem is that it's factually wrong. The distinction between parents and outsiders might not matter the same way in different societies, as we've observed with these problems of translations, right? The language might not even have a word for a bounded parent-child unit as separate from a lineage or a household. So again, think back to this Japanese word, kazoku, that originally refers to households, but changes definition over time as the household becomes more small, as households begin to correspond to nuclear family units, as the definition of family changes. Originally, nobody cares about this bounded parent-child unit. They care about households, and that's what the language reflects. Some families lack places. Our authors point out there are societies that have men's and women's houses where families don't live together and don't have any kind of hearth or home. And there are societies where households consist of relatives more broadly construed, Samoa, for example. And of course, as we've discussed, genealogical relationships don't always mean love. So how did we get all of this so wrong? Basically, again, by universalizing ideas about women and children that were actually specific to one place and time, that is, Victorian Europe and North America. So, Collier et al. Argue that, in fact, the family is a moral and ideological unit that appears in particular social orders, which is actually kind of what Ingalls argued, right? That nuclear families were particularly suited to industrial societies. And by family, we don't mean just relatives, but rather Malinowski's definition of the family, the nuclear family. So what are some of the features of our social order that give rise to this particular construct that we call the family? Collier and her co-authors think that it has a lot to do with a contrast between public and private space. And where public and political life is organized differently, we will find people organizing their kin relationships differently. And to say that people organize their kin relationships differently doesn't mean that they're big meanies who don't have feelings or don't love babies. It means that kin relationships will be organized differently and understood differently. It doesn't mean that people are not going to have meaningful emotional relationships with their relatives. And it also means that we have to take people in other societies seriously when they tell us about their important relationships and their lives. So, because the family is moral and ideological, we have to take away from this critique of the family some moral recommendations. So we can begin to ask, what do we want families to do? Not just here's the structure that we've inherited, but what do we want families to do? And then we can conduct some social science with an understanding of what kinds of human bonds suit people the best, what make them happiest, and how we might then want to reorganize or reconstruct society. Ultimately, family is a social construction, and so that means that it's a creative project, and we can work to develop kin relationships that nurture us in ways that we want. It's actually really optimistic. We also have some methodological recommendations about this concept that we often call ethnocentrism within anthropology. This is the tendency to view your own culture as normal and everything else as deviant. And ethnocentrism is bad because it can lead us to do things like insisting that the features of our own cultures are universal even when they're not, and to misrecognize other forms of kinship when we do encounter them. So, how do we avoid ethnocentrism? Or how do we counter this tendency within ourselves? Again, taking people seriously. Yeah, sure, any society you go to, you can probably identify who are the parents and who are their children. But if the local people don't really care about that unit, then you as an analyst can't care about that unit if you want to really understand a society. So again, we have to take other people seriously. Basically, that's what we have to do. And then finally, we have to understand that families are not necessarily natural, but again, are historical. You know, Ingalls and his the scholars that he was relying upon, their analysis was wrong. But in some ways, they were kind of right because they understood that our concept of family is historical. And we don't want to say that families evolve from lower forms into higher forms, right? Because we do want to hold on to Malinowski's insight that humans are always complicated. But if we stop viewing the family as natural and universal, we can actually meaningfully understand how it changes. So, thank you for hanging on through all of this with me, and I will talk to you next time.